Hey everybody, my name is Robert Douglas. I work for Platform SH and I'm very happy to bring you another episode of Deploy Friday today. That was our theme music. The topic of the day is GraphQL, and we have two esteemed guests, Lucas Santos and Josh Oppenheim, and I'm hoping that they will clear a couple fundamental things up. I'm also here with my colleague, Chad Carlson. Hi, Chad.
Hey there.
I'm hoping that our guests can clear a few fundamental things up in my mind about GraphQL. And we're going to get right into it because the confusion in my mind is overwhelming. And you can really believe me on that point. So without any further ado, we're going to go straight to the questions, the hard-hitting questions. Josh, what is GraphQL?
It's a good question. GraphQL is a language. So it's its own language, and it's a declarative language similar to SQL. So you can declare what your data structures look like, and you get it back. And this is not technology specific. The most common implementation is in JavaScript, where we can use GraphQL, but the language itself is entirely on its own. And you can read a lot more about the GraphQL itself on the GraphQL docs and the graphql.org. And stay away from all the coding libraries and just stay in GraphQL 100%. You can learn the language and ramp up and get to a point where you're ready to use it. It allows you to declaratively say, hey, I want this data to look like this, and expect what you get back. So every time that call is made, it's always going to come back that structure. You can say, I want to add a field onto that, and you can choose that as well. So it's a bit different than REST. REST allows you to grab one resource by ID or whatever, but you don't get to decide what fields they are going to be. And you don't get to put them together, and you don't get to describe your data. So
great. And we are going to compare GraphQL to REST as part of this show, but we're not quite there yet because I am still super confused. And I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Josh Oppenheim. I'm a senior software engineer at this Labs. I do a lot of GraphQL. I also do a lot of API work in Node. So that's kind of where I live a lot. I've played with PHP as well. And .NET has been in my back pocket for some time. But GraphQL is my passion. So that's kind of where I'm at. And what you want Lucas to introduce, or do you want me to just go ahead and more describe kind of what it is? And
I just wanted to interject real quickly that you don't meet people every day who say GraphQL is my passion. And A, I hope that you have a T-shirt that says the same. And B, out there in the audience, if you've been looking for the person in your life for whom GraphQL is the passion, you've got his Twitter handle right there. You know where to find him. So Lucas, let's start with your introduction. Please introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Lucas Santos. I am all the way from Brazil. I work at Microsoft. I am a cloud advocate over there for containers and distributed applications. Mostly, I've worked with GraphQL a lot a few years back, actually a few months back. But now my focus is more on containers, and actually the other part of this presentation, which is REST and communication among microservices. So gRPC, REST, and HTTP requests, and so on. I do a lot of API work, mostly on Node.js and JavaScript. And well, basically my background is fully fledged on JavaScript and TypeScript since like 2014 or something. But I've worked with Java, .NET, PHP for a long time. And as you can see, there's the PHP elephant on my back. And well, now I doing what I like to do, working with JavaScript and Kubernetes and containers and a lot of these technical slang that we see a lot of in nowadays technology environment.
Fantastic. So Josh tried and partially succeeded in clearing up the utter confusion in my mind about what GraphQL is. And what I got from Josh's answer is that it's a declarative query language for getting data from something, and you have a predictability about the structure in which it comes back, which is really nice. It's kind of like an interface in a programming language in that respect. But it wasn't clear to me who uses it and why and when. Maybe you could answer that for us. Lucas.
Well, based on my experience and what I've done, GraphQL is widely used. I started using GraphQL when it first came out, like, I don't know, 3 years ago or 4 years ago or something like this. And in my experience, everything I've done, GraphQL is very, very, very well used on APIs that you need a very wide range of like distributed systems. You have like a lot of different API calls that are calling different systems, and they all need different request responses. And when you do REST, you can't actually change the response of an API or a route without changing the route itself. So you get like this /v1/v2, or if you want like, oh, I have a user with 500 fields on this, but the front end just need like 2 of them. Well, no matter, you get all the 500, and this is like your 50 megabytes of data that you're gonna travel through all the REST interface and all the HTTP requests, and this is going to be heavy and so on. So the idea of GraphQL is basically to reduce the amount of under and over fetching that you do when using the semantic HTTP queries and HTTP requests, and avoid this /v1/v2 caching versioning. And actually, it makes a lot easier when you have to write like APIs that makes a very wide use of filters. So you can filter very well, and you can expect to receive exactly what you asked for. And it's very self-documenting. So the main reason why I think GraphQL, for me, is very widely used is because I used to work in a company that didn't have a very good time with documentations, and we had like 30 microservices, and all the documentation were like the developers who built those services. And one day, one of those developers left the company, and now they have like a legacy that no one knows how to deal with. And GraphQL is excellent for this because it's self-documenting along with its schema. So you can just see and read the API, and everything is there. Basically, I think this is the main points. I think Josh can talk about a few more of those.
Let me wrap up what I just heard you say, though, so I make sure I understand it. Because remember, the goal here is to clear up the confusion in my mind. Nothing else matters. Only do I understand what you're talking about. So what I heard you say is that if you have a backend landscape that has a lot of disparate APIs, okay, and they all need to be tied together, that GraphQL is kind of like a middle layer interface between all of those. You can talk to the GraphQL in a unified way, but that middleware is kind of like talking to all of the APIs, maybe pulling in their data, transforming it into something that the GraphQL can understand. Is that right? And if so, Josh, is there always a middleware layer in a GraphQL use case?
No, I mean, it's a hard answer. Technically, so there's other use cases, right? So I'll just discuss that a little bit as well. But yes, what you're saying is correct. You want to go through this. I call it, like, a lot of the use cases I address is we're building a new front end, or we're creating a back end for a front end. And so we're going to create that layer so that it can talk to whatever data sources. And the front end doesn't care about the data sources at that point. So the front end, the benefit is there's one entry point, there's one HTTP, there's only one place. You don't have to learn all these different API locations or anything. You just go to one and you make your request. And from that point, nothing else matters from the visibility of the front end, just like any consumer, really. But this is just my use case usually. It's more clear, right? Because a front end is clearly wanting something structured for their page, right? So it's like, let me ask for that structure, which APIs generally never return. They're not going to return a screen-specific data structure. That's not what they're for. So in that situation, yeah, absolutely have that middleware there. Now, there's other situations like, you have tools like Gatsby, for example, which will roll it all into one. It'll make your front-end app for you, and you use GraphQL. And it's doing that for you, but it's still calling out to whatever data sources you need to go to. The resolvers are still doing that. So that the part of the GraphQL that you're talking about that's transforming is the resolver function that gets called for whatever query that is. So consumer makes a request, consumer declares what the data structure is supposed to look like. Resolver says, I know what request that is. I'm going to take the input and run this function. And that's where that magic happens. It goes to whatever data sources it needs to. It transforms the data in any way it needs to and returns that same exact data structure. That resolver can be anywhere. I've built front ends where the resolvers are on the front end because we didn't want the back end involved. They didn't want to buy in and build a server. So we put the resolver in the front end and allowed the UI developers to still benefit from, predictable results and such. But we kept the server, right, in the front end. And it's not that costly. It's actually very cheap to do that in the sense of like dependencies and whatnot. So it depends, right? But ultimately, you're going to go through that function. Wherever that function lives, generally, it's going to be a server or middleware, right? But sometimes it lives other places. But that resolver function, wherever you stick that, that's where you're going to get from. That's where the magic happens. So wherever that consumer's calling to, it's hard to say all the time because there's very specific use cases, right?
So you mentioned Gatsby just now.
Yeah, it's a tool, right?
Right. We're actually familiar with it because we've done a Deploy Friday on it, and I asked similar hard-hitting questions of the Gatsby team that I'm asking of you now, and they progressively cleared up any confusion that I had about Gatsby. Chad, you have worked with Gatsby quite a bit, right? What other technologies have you worked with for Platform SH in terms of like making templates that utilize GraphQL in some way?
A lot of that work has been in this space of pulling data sources into a Gatsby front end. So that would be supporting a backend of Drupal, WordPress, and Strapi more recently, where either you add an additional, I guess it would be this resolver stage potentially on this backend part for, through some kind of GraphQL plugin on Strapi, for example, that then allows you to pull all these disparate data sources into Gatsby. That's primarily what I've worked on in this Gatsby space, which I think makes me interested because you mentioned before, Josh, that you see a lot of GraphQL in the JavaScript space. What's in your mind responsible for either this earlier wide adoption specific to JavaScript that you see there?
So I'm going to take some liberty because I haven't looked entirely into it. This is just my personal opinion, but the initial development of GraphQL being, Facebook creating it for one of their mobile applications, I suspect it was in JavaScript that they wrote that mobile application. And so they implemented it first with GraphQL JS. And that's my first, I'm taking liberty. I could be completely wrong, but because it starts in that world, I've seen the majority of all the tooling start in JavaScript. So like in PHP, there's some tooling, but it's nothing compared to, and maybe Lucas might actually know better than I do about like the tooling. I know about Lighthouse, I believe, in the world of PHP for implementing GraphQL. But regardless, like I think it would be just because that's the technology it originated from, and so most front ends are built with some kind of JS framework. And so they need a library that's in their language. So that's another reason, because it was very much a backend for front end before it became this, before it started evolving into an API solution as well. Again, my own personal opinion, but
I figured that might be the case.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if that was.
Yeah, I think that that's also my personal opinion. But when I started, there wasn't like Apollo or any other frameworks for GraphQL yet. So I built one of the things that led me to build my own client for GraphQL was the difficulty of finding something that actually was simple enough to call GraphQL endpoints. At that time, it was like 2016, 2017, or something like this. That was the very beginning of the GraphQL adoption. But since it's like turned into APIs and front ends, like Josh said, the main language we use to build front ends is JavaScript and other field that compiles to JavaScript. So probably that's why, and Node had a lot of effort to a lot of participation on this, because when we have let me tell you my story. When I had a front end, I had another API, and I knew that there was a lot of tooling for front ends to call backend GraphQL applications. But there wasn't much tooling for backend applications to call another GraphQL backend application, because there was everything was turned into React or Vue or Angular or something like this that was built in the framework, and you had to extract something. And what you can do is just a simple HTTP request with a post request with a few payloads, and GraphQL will answer you back. So I think this is the wide adoption, because since the language of internet is JavaScript, it's just with a lot of quotes, but it's the adoption is it's way more easy than adopting in other languages as well.
That totally makes sense. What do you're saying yourself, you weren't necessarily finding client libraries that fit the specific use case. I'm definitely curious of when I approached GraphQL, it was in this very specific use case of Gatsby and source plugins. How difficult do you think beginners are finding getting familiar with the basic concepts of GraphQL and how it's going to be different than how they're used to working with REST?
Well, I think GraphQL is easier to learn than REST, because GraphQL leaves little to no room for interpretation for basically those HTTP verbs that we, up until today, even though the RFC 2616 came out like thousands of years ago, we still debate over whether it's better to use put or patch for update requests on REST. So GraphQL doesn't have you doubting like this. So basically, GraphQL uses the same, like Josh said, it's only one endpoint, and you're supposed to create queries. And these queries use a defined language, and that's it. You won't be needing oh, should I use post? Should I respond with a 200, with 406, 404, or something like this? You don't have to worry about those things. My specific use case was on Kubernetes. I had two services. One was a log service, and the other ones were the one that actually generates the log and consumes the log. So to generate the log, we use backend services. And to consume the log, we use front-end services, because we need to read those logs. And all the GraphQL.js implementation was done by strings. So you have to actually write a string with a query. And there wasn't template strings at that time, so you had to actually unify the strings with a plus. And there was a whole heap of a lot of strings that you should deal with. The code was a mess. So the solution that I built for that was called GotQL, because Got was the REST interface that we were using to consume these APIs. But it's actually the idea was the language. When I turned the GraphQL into a JSON-like interface, and then you can just create an object and use these objects to build your own query, and it will parse the JSON object into a query, and then you could communicate with another service. But this was already done on front-end frameworks like Angular. There was tooling that allowed you to parse simple objects into GraphQL queries, but they were only embedded in the framework, and you had to extract them. It was very complicated. But the main reason I did this because GraphQL is basically a language over REST, over HTTP. So you can just communicate using plain old HTTP with a different payload.
I've got some questions. Still working on my confusion. Lucas, you mentioned something called Apollo. Chad, you've been working with Apollo, right? What did you do with that recently?
Mostly I've been seeing what Rudy has been working with Apollo.
Well, what is Apollo, first of all?
It is you might have a better interpretation than that. I don't know how much over the shoulder I've had with his Apollo work.
Lucas, what's Apollo?
Well, I have never used Apollo, but it's a GraphQL framework for building GraphQL applications, I believe.
Josh,
That's
can you
my...
build on that? What's Apollo?
Sure. Generally, I pick Apollo for servers. So Apollo is, like Lucas said, and everyone's saying, it's a platform, it's a framework that allows us to easily use GraphQL, whether it's a client or a server, and they work really well together. Surprise. So I'll talk about client because client's really great. One of the benefits that I think GraphQL adds to the client, besides making the boilerplate pretty easy, taking care of that, they also allow they actually have their own state store. So they take it a step further and they actually create an alternative to Redux, where you can actually create your state store, and the state store is the GraphQL schema. So they take that and they allow you to make your queries, and it'll update the store for you behind the scenes. So you don't have to be any explicit about that at all. Yep, sorry.
Where is the state store? I've got something
Sorry.
like front-endy, and then I've got something like middleware, and I've got something back-endy.
So,
Where is it?
Sorry, so front-end development, right? So if you get complex enough, you want to manage your state for screens. And
so this is actually in the browser or on my phone.
Yeah, it's cached in the browser, right? So basically, the state store allows me to keep track of how everything's looking on the front end without having to check with the server, right? So it's their source of truth on the front end. And there's tools and various uses. React has hooks now out of the box. There's a lot of ways to do that. Apollo provides that alternative. So I'm already declaring and saying I want my data to look this way. So instead of having to go and update my store to look that way as well, or add whatever I need to, which you have to do client-side variables all the time that don't get sent to the server, Apollo will manage that whole thing for you. So, and it just moves whatever you've requested into the cache for you, and you don't have to worry about it. So there's a big, for me, that's a huge thing, because it allows me not to have to worry about a lot of other nuances when it comes to state. So that's a big benefit of Apollo. Other people choose not to use it, and there's other tools that are a little more lightweight, because people do complain about Apollo being too heavy and big. That's okay. There's other ones. Relay is one that Facebook came out with. It's a little more lightweight. It's nice. So there's a lot of options out there. Another thing that GraphQL Apollo server will wrap Express or other API frameworks in JavaScript for you. So I don't have to create my own Apollo client. Like if I create an Apollo server, it'll spin up on its own, it'll host itself, and that's awesome. And it also comes with this great interface called GraphQL, which allows me to play with my queries. And it's just I don't have my screen share. I would totally walk you through. It's really cool. You can do a lot with it. So because GraphQL by itself on the server is just a function. So if I want a server, I need to either spin up an Express server and then run the GraphQL function. But if I use GraphQL server, of course, it does all that for me, and you make your requests and the function gets called and it does that all for me. So there's boilerplate, right, that it's going to take out of your hands. What else can I say about Apollo? They have great plugins for. They come out of the box ready to work with React, but they also have an Apollo Angular. There's an open source project for that, which is really great for all the Angular people if they want to use it. So now, of course, backend, right? You can have an Apollo server and you don't have to have. It doesn't have anything to do with the client, right? So if I want to make my client let's say my server, I'm trying to think of an alternative for the front end. Usually it's the backend has a different server, right? Like let's say I have a PHP backend. I implement GraphQL server using PHP, but my front end is React. My client can be a Apollo client, and I can make, as long as my request, like Lucas was saying, is the right structured HTTP request, because under the hood, it's just a post request. It's just structured away, right? It's structured in a way that GraphQL can be read, because it's the language that we're after. So you can do that. Any client, any source. Postman does GraphQL requests for you now. So you can use Postman and call any server you want. So GraphQL allows you to make a request, and it'll actually give you the schema back as a response. I believe that might be Apollo server. I don't think just GraphQL JS will do that for you. So you can make a request and the front end can get the schema back, which is
That's
awesome.
neat.
Yeah.
So what I understood,
types off that too. Sorry, go ahead.
so what I understood from you just now is that Apollo is actually two components. There's a front end component and a server component. And I didn't know that. I think that what Rudy and Chad, Rudy's one of our colleagues, have done with Apollo server, now I understand, is they've used that as a middleware to aggregate APIs like YouTube was the example. And then there was a React front end. So the React would query the Apollo server, which was then aggregating APIs in the backend. And they were, getting the data put together in a transparent way to the front end, so the front end didn't have to worry about the different data sources. Which brings me to another question. What about the graph part of GraphQL? Why is it called GraphQL? And I'll preface this with what my understanding is, not knowing the answer. When I think of a graph, I think about all these things that are connected in a way, and you can traverse the graph going from one thing to another thing to another thing. And that's sometimes a little bit different than a SQL query, which might just grab non-related data and bring it back all at once. So I'm thinking then of these REST APIs that you might be aggregating and putting together somehow. Do they have to have interrelations? Do you actually get a connected graph in the data in the backend? Can I start like a user, and then I say from the user, I want their friends, and from their friends, I want the ones who are like, in Miami? What do you do?
I can take a crack. I don't know if it's going to be exactly what, in regards to the graph part of it, but in the general sense of making a GraphQL request with related data, I do not need to wait for one resolver to finish for the other one to go to run its query. So like fields are functions. So in that sense, it'll go, it doesn't wait. Like if something comes back and it's not ready for the other one, it doesn't matter. It'll still respond with that. So I don't know if that's helpful, if that's really what you're looking for, but there's a major benefit to GraphQL where you can, each piece is its own function. It doesn't have anything to do with, like, I think with SQL, you have to, like you said, it comes back once everything's done. It's got everything, right? So please, Lucas.
Yeah, well, this is something that has been bugging me since I started learning GraphQL. This is something that I actually never answered fully because I think GraphQL was named after that because Facebook created GraphQL, and Facebook has a Graph API, and the Graph API on Facebook is something. It's easier when when I worked. I don't know if you have worked with Neo4j yet, but that's a graph database. When you look at graphs from the perspective of a drawing, from a diagram perspective, it's very, very easy to see how the data is connected, and Neo4j does that like masterfully. But when you look at graphs from the perspective of a JSON, it's completely mess. It's difficult to see when a graph connects to another graph because an edge is not actually an arrow from a node to another node. It's just another JSON object. But you don't need to use this graph approach. You just need to create your data. You can have like related data without having graph on this. This is what I most worked about. But you can actually have a GraphQL query that returns like Facebook does. If you use the Graph API, it's GraphQL, and it returns you a list of nodes. And this list of nodes has a list of edges. And these edges connect to another node that you can query again. And the idea is not to actually have a graph when you can traverse this graph, because each traversal you do is actually another HTTP request. So you're not actually traversing the graph, you are requesting the graph again. But it's more like a linked list. This is not the explanation why it's called GraphQL, but for your doubt, you don't need to have a backend data organized as a graph to use GraphQL. You don't need to do that. You can have like a like Star Wars API does. Star Wars API is a GraphQL test API, which I use a lot for placeholder.
There's a Star Wars API?
Yeah.
There's a Star Wars API and nobody ever told me that?
It's awesome, man. It's very, very cool. And
I'm going to go try that API.
It's free. It's free. You can use that. The idea is that the idea was that traversing through graphs would be easier than just requesting things again. But then again, when you put graphs on JSON, it becomes a monster. So it's very difficult to see things on as a graph on JSON because it's a linear structure. But you don't need, answering your question on summing up, you don't need to have a graph-related interface or graph-related data to build your GraphQL API. You can just build it using your plain old SQL or MongoDB knowledge.
Well, it sounds, in fact, like the name is actually a branding side effect from Facebook's legacy graph API that they used to expose as a search function for people until they realized that not only was it the ultimate stalker tool ever created, but it was giving away too much for them for business purposes, and they reeled it back in so that they could give away far less information and charge more money. So those were the good old days of Facebook, when you could go on their graph search interface and basically research anybody on Facebook using any demographic criterion that you could think of. I think the most visible place that Facebook has that still that I'm aware of is in their advertising API with all their demographic data. Okay, that helps. Thanks a lot. Okay,
sorry.
I have another question.
I got it.
I have another question, by the way. So there was the title of the show indicated that we were going to have a bit of a comparison between REST and GraphQL. I'd like to mix that up a little bit more even, and I'd like an opinion about a third buzzword technology. The first time I encountered GraphQL was when the Drupal project was evaluating GraphQL as their API layer. And they ended up settling on the JSON API as far as I remember. And there were a bunch of arguments why the JSON API was more native, better, easier, whatever, that I don't remember any of the details about. But if you were going to describe REST, GraphQL, and API and the advantages and disadvantages, what would you have to tell us, Josh?
Sorry, trying to unmute. You're asking the benefits versus the disadvantages of GraphQL when it comes, just compare the two with REST, or what would I do if I had an API like Drupal and I wanted to use GraphQL as a client?
You can leave Drupal out of this. I'm worried. I'm interested about the big picture with those three.
Okay, sure. But Drupal as one. I haven't worked with Drupal, so I can't compare Drupal.
That's okay.
But I could say using REST versus GraphQL. So I'll just stick with it. So like Lucas had talked about earlier, REST has an overfetching problem, right? Or if I want to make, in my opinion, so GraphQL, I make one call, I describe my data, I get it back. REST, I make X amount of calls, I get my data, I structure it myself, I put it where it needs to go, and I discard the rest. So there's wasted data, time. There's a whole lot of reasons why I wouldn't want to use REST. REST is fantastic at getting specific. I mean, it's very predictable in the sense of you have a resource and you have four different, you can read it, you can get it, you can change it, you can get rid of it, you can create a new one. You have a way of entering into that database and really managing data. And I think that's fantastic. So I think they both have their place. Generally speaking, I would say GraphQL is REST APIs are generally the data sources I use. So it's just a layer. I don't like to say let's replace it. I like to say, because even clients are still making post requests. It's still a HTTP request. It's not anything new. It's just, and it's still going to a server and it's still calling an endpoint. So, but as far as that goes, I mean, the use case dictates to me what I should use. And so if I'm trying to manage a database and really just manage data, it depends. I'll probably jump on, an API REST versus GraphQL. I weigh the learning curve of the devs as well. It depends on what they know. So Drupal, they assessed a multitude of different factors. It's not just, is this technology better? It's like, well, how many people know this technology? And how much money is it going to cost to get that technology to ramped up in our place where we can really maintain that well, among other reasons, right? But the class.
Come on, Josh. Josh, sorry to interrupt, but in technology, there's no room for moderation. This is a world of absolutes here, right? I need to know what the best is, and then I'm going to run with that.
You're asking the wrong person. So the longer I work in technology, right, the more I realize there is no right technology. It just depends. And but I would say from a front, like in a general sense, I don't want to have to call my server multiple times for data. I want to call one time, right? So if I'm in that use case and that's the world I live in, GraphQL is my tool. I want every time, because I don't want to have to manage the data structure when I get it back. And I don't want to have to spend extra calls to get it. It's wasteful. And if there's a solution where I don't have to do that, and really the only issue here is learning a little bit it's easier to learn in SQL. And if I'm a developer, if I've learned JavaScript or any of the major languages, it's not a big issue to learn GraphQL. So I think that's why I generally choose GraphQL over REST in my use cases. But again, self-documentation is great, but Swagger does that as well. You get that as well. So I don't know.
You said something just now, though, that piques my curiosity. So about multiple REST calls and the wastefulness. Let's go back to that situation where you've got an Apollo server and you've got many disparate backends that it's talking to, and you're doing GraphQL on that. Now, the alternative would be for my front end to just do those calls out to the disparate data sources itself and have the innate knowledge on how to talk to them and the API keys and all of that basically baked into the client, yada, yada, yada. But wouldn't that be overall less computing than a middleware doing that, aggregating them, and then the client querying the middleware? I mean, you're saying it's wasteful, but are you... In that case, you're not actually cutting down on computing, right? You're just, it's wasteful of developer effort.
Yeah, sure. So this is philosophically, I would say, like, if I can get the UI developers' hands out of managing that data, I've saved a lot of money. And generally the money that I'm spending on that, the extra calls on that layer is going to be, I'm going to save a ton more money on developer costs than I would on having my developers manage all those API keys and all the data stuff that you talked about and not working on UI. So,
I agree with you. For the record, I agree with you.
Right. Otherwise, why would you, it sounds like that was the intention behind your plugins that you're using with Gatsby. You wanted to be able to do that. So, and I think that's one of the main reasons people choose GraphQL is when they want to have a backend for their front end. They don't want their UI developers having to manage all that. They want, I think Netflix, actually, that was their use case. Or it was PayPal's use case was, correct me if I'm wrong, but their use case was, we are spending X amount of money on UI developers doing data than not building UI. And they moved to GraphQL and they saved themselves a ton of money and they let their devs really build UI. And so their production time, things got developed much quicker.
I agree with Josh in most of the points. GraphQL is, for me, it's better suited when you have something that is consuming it. I don't think GraphQL and REST are, enemies or things that are opposites. I think they are complementary. I think when for me, in instance, I don't like the syntax for mutations on GraphQL. I don't like to use GraphQL to create or update data or delete data. In my opinion, GraphQL is a query language because it's QL. So I use it a lot with gets. So when I have something that I need to get and I need filters on this, like logs. Logs are the best, I think, are the best use case for GraphQL because in this terms of getting, because logs have a lot of information. You can have like a ton of things, and you usually want to log more than log less. So you want to, be more logger than, when you need it, you don't have the information. But you don't need all that information on your front end. So the fact that you can actually underfetch or overfetch, you can solve this issue, and you can actually query one single log endpoint and get all the logs from different applications. That was my use case. You can get different logs from also different applications with a single query, and you can actually manipulate that log the way you want it to be on the front end side. You actually save a lot of time, and constantly you save a lot of money with that time, because the front-end developers won't be querying like different APIs that are bound to break if some of those things change. The other option you can do is to create another API that unites all the APIs into one, and if one of those APIs change, the main API is going to break and the front end is going to break. So my main use case for this is that I think REST and GraphQL should be used together. REST could be used to input data or actually do actions on this, like update, delete, and post things. And while GraphQL can be used to do those things, I find better to use GraphQL to retrieve the data and have a better interface with all the developers around. So you can have one single GraphQL endpoint that can query all your APIs in the front end. So it's easier. When you're doing this on the back end, on the other hand, like querying data from other services in the backend, I find easier to do it on REST than using GraphQL, because it's either another layer that you're going to have to put on top of the layer that you already have on REST to create, do like a simple communication. And usually microservices communicating with microservices don't need to have this elasticity of data that comes out of them. They already know what they want, and they already know who they are going to ask for. So they just can't get this.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. We actually have a question from the audience if we're interested. Not quite formed as a question, but get your guys' opinion on it. I've heard that GraphQL is the modern JSON version of SOAP, and his follow-up is change my mind. Either of you have a take on that? Thanks, Larry.
I've heard the same thing.
I don't think that GraphQL is like SOAP. Well, I used SOAP and it's terrible, and I don't ever want to go through this experience again of using SOAP. But the main reason why GraphQL is compared to SOAP, it's because another layer of communication. SOAP was XML over HTTP over modern TCP communication. So the idea was that SOAP would make it easier for you to query things and to receive a structured document. The problem is that XML is very, verbose, and you would get like, I want a user. Oh, so, okay, so here's this document of 50 pages about the user you want. And most of the things on XML is garbage. Like you have like a ton of defining things and closing tags,
namespaces, more namespaces.
Yeah, it's like a lot of things that you're not going to use. And JSON came to solve this issue in particular. JSON came to solve the problem that XML was too verbose, and you are going to replace all the namespaces and everything with simple brackets and columns and so on. The idea, I think they are comparable, but I don't think it's comparable by the thing that made SOAP SOAP. I think GraphQL is like more, it's way easier to learn than SOAP. The tooling is way better than SOAP for all the languages. Even the languages that are not supported by GraphQL have a better tooling than SOAP had when it supported a few languages. I think the .NET part was actually .NET and Java was the best languages when you could actually use SOAP generally, because like .NET uses XML internally, so it has a very good support for this. But like PHP was a mess, and JavaScript is a bigger mess because it doesn't support XML out of the box. You have to like push everything and get everything out of things. But GraphQL is portable. I think they learn from SOAP, but it's another layer, which is not a layer after all, because it's HTTP, so it's the same layer with a different communication. I think it's comparable, but not so much comparable. And I really did wish that I had GraphQL when I used SOAP, because that was a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him, Lucas. I mean, I think it's similar. I think that that's okay too. I don't think it necessarily has to not be similar to SOAP, because SOAP was independent of technology, and so is GraphQL. It's a way of describing data. It's using a different way. XML is its own way, and GraphQL is its own language. So I would say it's an improved implementation that or type that leans in a direction SOAP was leaning. But I think all the good parts of SOAP, not the negative parts, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that even changes your mind. It may be the new SOAP, but it may. I think it solves. It doesn't have a lot of the issues that SOAP inherently had. So
fair. I hope that did change his mind, at least to be a little bit more optimistic about working with it. Lucas, I have to admit, I really like the case that you just said of you having multiple microservices that you're specifically trying to accumulate and be able to narrow down specific logs from. That is like this really good GraphQL use case, but is still segregated, where you're not necessarily going to want to use that same tooling between the services themselves. So let's say we do have the circumstance of somebody's trying to do that exact same thing. They're not using GraphQL to access logs from these multiple applications. What's migration look like to try and implement something that you're going to say? How hard is it to take something that might be set up as REST to access those logs to try and deal with all that data to then migrate to GraphQL?
That is a very cool question, because that was exactly my use case. I had a we had a API. This is very nice, this story, because the API had names and was superhero names. And this API in particular was called Daredevil, because it didn't know about anything. It didn't see anyone, but it knew about everything that everyone was doing, because they sent logs to this API. So the first version of this API was created on REST in like 15 minutes. It was just a simple post and get request. You post a log and you get a log. And eventually the logs that were like thousands became millions. And these millions of stuff are very hard to, go through HTTP sockets. So the first option we had was to implement paging. So you had like one page out of 1,000 pages and searching. But MongoDB is as good to search as a few number of things. And when you go to like a million stuff and you have to aggregate data, MongoDB doesn't do this very well. An aggregation framework on MongoDB was not the thing that it was built for, but it works, but it's slow. So the idea was to migrate to another database, the first option we had, to Elastic. But it was going to require another VM and so on. And I said, well, let's try this new GraphQL stuff. It was, in the hype, it was on beta. Let's try beta things in production. What could go wrong? And fortunately, nothing went wrong in production. We used the beta version of GraphQL for a while. But the major difficulty we had was that the API, we didn't have other tooling like Apollo or anything that was actually built on GraphQL from the start. So the idea was to rebuild it using GraphQL. Since we had to learn GraphQL to rebuild that thing using GraphQL, we could actually keep most of the architecture. So the architecture of the API was using REST and still continue to use REST. But we could just change the presentation layer from a HTTP request to a GraphQL, actually an HTTP request using GraphQL. So overall, it was very simple to migrate. The downside was that we had to create a new version, and the new version wasn't compatible with the old version. Despite we used on that time we used mutations to create new logs, and we used GraphQL to retrieve those logs. In this particular case, it was very smooth. I did the migration, and I found like it was very, very cool to do it. I was learning something new, and I was creating something out of a new technology. And it worked very well with Kubernetes and distributed applications. I thought that might break when you scale this thing, horizontally, or when you did more things. But GraphQL works a lot with distributed applications and works very well with stateless applications. So I think overall migrating today, even today, is easier because you have tools that do this for you. So it's very okay. It's very nice. It's not a very painful process to migrate from a REST API to use a GraphQL interface. You can even do it with the API online. You can just add another layer on top of it, and you can still have the API using the REST interface along with the GraphQL interface. This is what I did on my last gig with GraphQL. We used a presentation layer to receive data using REST, using the post interface, and we use another presentation layer to give the data using GraphQL queries. So I think this is the best of both worlds in general, and I didn't have any problems or delays on this.
I have a question for Josh. So we've done a lot of pros and cons for GraphQL, and maybe some of the people who are listening are now convinced that they'd like to try it. What path would you suggest for somebody who is just starting out to get their feet wet, learn, get set up really quickly? What's the best way to jump in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm always trying to think of the best way. So I think the best way to learn is to stay out of the technology first. So go to graphql.org and start looking at their the language. Because if you want to learn GraphQL, let's learn GraphQL and then let's learn implementation. So start going through that. You'll find yourself wanting to try some of these queries out. There's a online tool, and I can provide some of these links. I don't have any of them on hand, but I can provide some of these after the show, or I can make a comment on the YouTube channel or whatever. But I would go into these online playgrounds and just play with it. Don't even worry about implementing it yourself. Just go play with the queries, see what you can get going, and learn GraphQL. When you get to a point where you want to learn, like implement the actual GraphQL technology, I would just go to the GraphQL. Assuming you're a JavaScript developer, I would go to the GraphQL JS library, and I would just use that and just invoke the function, and just see that you're like how it works, because it demystifies everything when you really just call the GraphQL function and feed it a callback to run on the query that's used. When you're using the query, it's all called at the same time. You kind of lose that knowledge when you're using a tool, because you're just like, I don't know, it's a black box. I'm making this call and it's working. But if you're actually implementing that library and you see how simple it really is, great. So once you have that grasp of the concepts of what's happening, resolvers, and you're making a query and they're running, and you've got that information, go find a tool you like. Now, I would say there's a lot of resources for that. I have a template on my GitHub for a GraphQL server in TypeScript using Apollo Server. I can leave a link for that as well. You can just clone that, and it'll spin up an empty, TypeScript Apollo Server with a hello world, just a hello world query that works. So you can kind of see how it all works and everything, and then you can tweak it how you want. It has so there's tools out there. Also, I would look up the Guild is a collection of people that it's a company run by, I think he's the owner. It's hard to say owner because they all work really well together, but it's a group of guys that work on GraphQL tooling. They're the ones that provided like CodeGen, Mesh, all these tooling. Apollo Angular is written by one of them. So they have a lot of good resources on their GitHub and on their site. If you go to the guild.org or .com, I can't remember exactly. I'll leave that link as well. And they're also very receptive. So if and I don't think they mind me saying that if you reach out to them as well for help, they're very, very receptive. They're always willing to help. So the community is awesome. There's a lot of people out there. I think, I'll leave some links for, there's a Discord where you can ask GraphQL questions. So there's a lot of people out here ready to help. You just got to find out where we are. And I've utilized it like crazy to get to where I am. And I continue to use it because I'm still learning. And I wouldn't be able to use it in the way that I can without the community. So I do want to say the community is a huge, huge resource.
That's good to hear. Yeah. And when you mentioned the guild, I almost expected to hear you say that they utilize the Star Wars API. So I'm like making these connections in my mind, but that doesn't exactly exist, does it? No. We have another question from the audience, open to anybody who wants to take it. In what use cases would you still use REST despite being GraphQL familiar? Specific examples, please.
Well, I can give you my last working thing that I'm doing. It's a scheduling app for a company here, and there's no need for them for GraphQL because they don't have like a lot of data to retrieve, and we don't have a lot of endpoints to call. So the idea of GraphQL, when you have a communication mass, when you have like several endpoints you need to call, like a ton of microservices, and you are having overhead calling these APIs, like we did when we had like 35 microservices, and we had to call each one of them for getting, like we have a campaign microservices, and we had to call 5 other microservices to fill that object. This is a pain. So this is a use case for GraphQL. When you have an object like on MongoDB or any other database that you need to complete this with other data, and this data come from another part of your system or either another system. This is a use case for GraphQL. When you don't need to use it is when you have only one API or a few handful of APIs that you can easily call, and just like they don't give much data back, and this data is small. GraphQL is all about data. So if you have a data problem, if you are getting like too much data when you need too little, like overfetching, or if you're not getting the data you want, then you have to create a new /v2. If you need to create a /v2, this is probably a good use case to GraphQL. If you ever need to create a v2 or /v3 or something, this is a very good indicator that you're going to need to use GraphQL sometime. But the idea of this scheduling API is simple. We have a front end, and it calls for users, it calls for schedulings, and calls for events, and this is it. We don't have to, join a lot of data. And when we do, we just join this data on creation. We don't need to update this data very often. So REST, in my opinion, today, since it's like thousands of years old, there is a lot of tools that make REST development way easier because it's simple HTTP. But if you want to make your application very fast and very easy to use on data-wise, I think GraphQL is your option. I think Josh can have more specific examples since I worked on a few things here and there.
Sure. Josh, do you have an example that you would add when you would use REST rather than GraphQL?
Gosh, that's a hard question. I'm trying to think of a use case I chose it over GraphQL. Yeah, I mean, okay. it's not entirely REST versus GraphQL. I'm sorry to say, but it's a, no, it is actually. We had front end devs, the client, they were using REST as opposed to GraphQL to actually access the GraphQL server because they didn't know GraphQL well enough. Like it was hard to learn and ramp up. So we used post requests, and I would write a lot of the GraphQL queries to help. That is not what you're asking. You're asking why legitimately.
I love that your answer. Sorry, I just love that your answer was, yeah, I have a very clear use case. It's when you don't know GraphQL.
I'll tell you what, I have been. I will try to be as specific as I can. I have been on certain projects where layers have been very much services accessing data and going through an API, so that all our services didn't touch the API, the database, right? And we chose post requests to be consistent with the rest of the company with what was going on. They were not ready to move to GraphQL. They were not ready to train the people yet. And again, you're asking for a technical reason. I don't have one. I'm sorry, but I have a reason. It's more resources and money wise. Like, it doesn't make sense. If GraphQL, I've been in situations where we've tried to make GraphQL make sense because it's new and it's GraphQL. And those are the reasons. I think that's a fantastic reason why you should not do it. So I think you should always find if it makes more sense to stick with REST for your company and your environment, stick with REST. There's no reason. Don't do it just for the sake of doing it. Generally, the project on, though, they've already established that that's the case, that they do want to go forward. So it's hard for me to give you a reason why I would actually choose to use REST over GraphQL in my use cases, because I haven't been in that situation yet.
Cool. Thank you. Well, we have come to the top of the hour. I feel like I understand a lot more about GraphQL, so that's no small achievement, Lucas and Josh. Thank you for that elucidation to me, illumination. I like illumination, as you can see by my background. If you would like to try GraphQL on Platform SH, we're going to leave a few links in the description of the show. Things like the Strappy plus Gatsby, or Drupal or WordPress plus Gatsby. Those are great examples where you can get going with GraphQL at the front end. Either now or in the very near future, we'll also have a template that you can launch on Platform SH that highlights the Apollo server with a React front end. So you can see that architecture. You can see how Apollo would aggregate APIs in the back end and then expose them, the data into GraphQL for the front end consumption. And other than that, thank you for watching. Join us again next week for another episode of Deploy Friday. And if you have any further questions for our esteemed panelists, Lucas Santos, Josh Oppenheim, or Chad Carlson, then the Twitter handles are there in the description. And I'm sure they'd like to hear what you've got to say. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Nice to meet you both, Josh, Lucas. Thanks for having me, Rob.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for calling.
Yep. Bye, guys.